living off the land. You're not going to the grocery store and paying for food. You're learning about nature and learning what's already out there that you can just go pick and eat and gain nutrition from without having to go through McDonald's or spend a lot of money at the grocery store. And I kind of think of looking for open source intelligence almost in a lot of ways like foraging. Rather than spending a lot of money on super expensive security tools, you can sort of just look outward at the public, look at information that's already sitting in the public domain, in the public consciousness, and use that in a meaningful and actionable way. So before I talk about some examples of how you can use open source intelligence, I'm going to give a bit of prehistory. How did we get here? How did so much intelligence information, how did all of these signals, so much signal, end up in the public internet? How did we reach this point? Also, I'm going to talk about some of the challenges that CISOs and security owners face in enterprises and small businesses when it comes to trying to manage and understand the security of both themselves and their third parties that they don't necessarily own, but they do business with. And how open source intelligence can help determine security posture non-intrusively and a lot of times free. So anybody actually who works in an enterprise company, a small business, if you're a security owner, if you're a pen tester, that precursor information is really great to know because it can really help you relate to the clients that you're dealing with and some of their biggest pain points, and also help to deliver meaningful information that help companies not just patch a hole, but actually improve and uplift their overall security posture in a repeatable way. I'll also talk about some common pitfalls that we see in the enterprise organizations with open source intelligence, ways to make open source intelligence actionable. There's a lot of sort of signal to noise ratio in open source intelligence. So how do you really identify the gem, the piece of gold that you can use, and how do you use it in a meaningful way? And some challenges with open source intel as well. So first I'm going to talk about what's happened in the past 10 years. How did we reach this point where human beings at this point in history have more information accessible at their fingertips than ever in recorded history? How did we reach the point where so much information just sort of ended up in the cloud? And if you think about, we're basically going through a paradigm shift. If you think about 10 or 20 years ago, what a data center looked like in an organization, in an enterprise organization, it generally sat in the basement, in the lower level where it was cool. You had giant cages. I mean, this is what kind of corporate cloud data centers look like now, but many large Fortune 1000 companies had and still have large internal data centers. You can sort of think of them as the traditional or legacy model. Data centers were in-house. You had physical access to them, so if there was a problem, if something went out, there was, you had the lock and the key. You could go into the room. You knew the people in the room around you. All of the system administrators had background checks. You eat lunch with them. You know them on a personal level. And you feel like you can trust them with your keys to the kingdom. Now, sort of juxtapose that against the new model, the cloud model, moving everything to a microservice in the cloud. Everything is off-premises, so you don't have a massive data center in your basement anymore. It's all in somebody else's data center, sometimes in a different country. You have no physical access to that data center, so if something goes down, if you're unsure about something, you've pretty much passed the responsibility and the risk on to some individual that you're sort of trusting to do a great job managing the data. But on the flip side, the cloud is a beautiful thing because it's 100% turnkey. So you literally can just plug and play. There's no, deep knowledge required to configure. There's no hardware implementation costs. It's completely elastic, so you only get what you need when you need it. And you don't have to maintain headcount. So from a company's perspective, it's a really beautiful thing because they don't have to invest in the deep employee knowledge that you used to see taking place. And it's also a very sad thing because you don't have as much in-house knowledge in terms of what's going on your network. In the sort of old landscape, you can think about kind of old versus new as fortress versus ecosystem. And the traditional way we thought about security was protecting the fortress. The fortress were the four walls of our business where all of the sensitive data was stored. You could step outside of the fortress and it was maybe kind of old and crumbling, but you can at least see where all of the holes are in the fortress or where maybe some work needs to be done. Whether or not you patch those holes is strictly up to how responsible the person is, but you can at least somewhat easily with common tools identify where these holes are. And you also own the blueprint. So you know the lay of the land. This is your territory that as a security owner you can navigate, you can understand, and you can diagnose and fix. You also have full control. So if you want security continuity, rolling out audit policies or procedures, you want to make sure all of your employees are following certain standards, you can literally, with a few configurations or the flip of a switch, ensure that everybody in the company is using two-factor authentication. You can actually monitor the behavior of those controls. You also know where the crown jewels are located. So, the sensitive employee information, credit card information, customer information, you know that it's sitting in a treasure chest inside the secret room. You know that you need to at least build a perimeter around that and have some guards and some safety measures to detect if anybody's trying to break in. And all of the data was centralized at this point, so you could have all of your logs under one room, under one house, piping to an aggregation system and have the insight that you need. Whether or not, again, the insight is fine-tuned enough to identify the outliers is really up to how diligent the individual is, but you at least have the control. And the mentality and the mindset behind protecting the fortress was, if we're going to get breached, what are we going to do about it? So we were never certain that we were going to get breached when protecting the fortress because we thought that we could control the four walls around us. But we felt like if it happened, let's have an action plan. Let's be prepared to know what to do. The landscape has vastly evolved from the fortress model. The entire landscape has become completely decentralized, and we've realized that commerce is not about everybody working within their four walls of the fortress, but everybody actually interconnecting and working together, almost like a hive or a honeycomb mentality, where companies are reliant on supply chain partners, business partners, various third parties for critical components of their business, like processing credit cards or paying for employee payroll. We depend on corporations, which are really just a house full of humans that we don't necessarily know or we've vetted, to take care of these critical functions of our organizations. The other big shift is we see that employees have now become empowered to sort of be their own CEO. They can be their own micro-organization walking around. Developers walk around with a laptop and have their employer's entire code repo cloned to their database. That means every employee is walking around with a little miniature version of the production environment on their laptop. And they're empowered to do so. It's encouraged because you're not restricted. You're not chained to the desk. You can go and work anywhere and still be able to get the same velocity of work accomplished. There's also a lot of trust that's put into the decentralized architecture. So when we're doing business with third parties, when we're doing business with supply chain partners, we don't have a great idea about maybe how they're protecting information, or the ways that we're measuring their security level are very archaic and esoteric. But we sort of rely on them to and hope and assume that our partners are at least as diligent as we are in protecting our information, but we don't really know for sure. And when you think about where the crown jewels are located, they're really everywhere. Like, we don't even really know for sure, but we know they're redundant, we know they're distributed, but we don't really know who's looking at them. So when you're storing your database and it's hosted by Rackspace or it's hosted by Amazon Web Services, we don't know who the engineers are behind the scenes that are managing those databases for us. We don't really know who's holding the keys to the kingdom. We've never done a background check on these employees. We've never sat and ate lunch with them. We've never built the level of trust that we used to have in the industry, but we're trusting them to manage and protect our data, at least up to our standards. And to boot, they're distributing the data not just in one location, but it's distributed everywhere. sort of under the guise of redundancy, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but has to be used with responsibility. And we have high dependencies on these, on our ecosystem partners. I'm sure as everybody can think back to a few years ago when, Amazon, for example, has an outage in their East Coast, commerce basically ceases for a day across the United States because one company has had an outage, not an entire outage, but an outage in just one section of their infrastructure. So the ratio impact is very high. A credit card processor going out for a day ceases commerce on your e-commerce website. You can no longer accept payments. The mentality has also changed in terms of where the risk lies. Generally, if there was any risk in a traditional organization, it lied within the fortress. Now the risk is distributed. There's not just one risk, but there are many degrees of risk. So you can think of sort of the breach by association mentality that we hear about a lot today. And it's not just those third parties, but it's also employees that work within your habitat. So remote employees traveling. If they get hacked, you get hacked. And the other paradigm shift that's taken place is it's no longer about if we get breached. And I know this is a cliche statement, but there are many, many, many companies that are still in the if mindset, that are still in denial about the fact that they've probably already been breached and just don't know it. We, as security professionals, know that the internet is inherently insecure. We're well aware of it. And to be frank, a lot of people are very fearful about how we're going to manage security in the cloud. But the public consciousness is not aware of these vulnerabilities. They have no idea that any of this is going on right now. So what happened? Why all of a sudden did we decide to just outsource and rely on third parties, rely on the cloud? What was the real, where did the pressure come from to make this pivot? Well, very traditionally in enterprises, the perception by board members, the perception by C-level executives is that security is a cost center, not a profit center, meaning you're not generating any profit for the company by implementing security. Maybe we can argue you certainly can, but it's a hard argument to make without concrete metrics and statistics and collateral. So the general perception is that security is a cost center. You're a utility that drains the company of money. And the CFO or the chief operating officer of companies will traditionally say things like, why are we spending so much money on this infrastructure? Why are we spending so much money on this massive retail footprint? Our entire basement is covered with electronics. We have thousands of employees that we're paying full-time salaries and benefits to manage and maintain. Why don't we just outsource it all to the cloud? I mean, it's there, it makes sense, it's cheap, it's easy. I just have to put in a credit card number. It takes 2 minutes. I mean, the whole thing is streamlined. So from an executive standpoint, when they're sitting down with their tech team and security owners, it's a no-brainer. And it's very hard to justify the opposite. No full-time headcount, no hardware footprint, zero maintenance. It's on someone else's shoulders. There's really no sunk costs, like hardware costs, for example, that depreciate year over year. So they view it as a cost savings. And this was realized back in the early 2000s, sort of right after the dot-com boom and bust. We saw hardware prices dramatically decreasing, and still today there's a huge push to decrease hardware manufacturing costs to be as cheap as possible and move all of the high-cost effort on building and developing the software. And this was realized very, very, very early on. CFOs were very much aware of this and have been pushing this agenda for over 10 years. Really today. Now, on the flip side, what we just now started to realize in the past 4 or 5 years is we kind of had like an oh shit moment. We realized that we gave all of our data to somebody else. So we've effectively relinquished all control of our data, all visibility of our data, and all transparency of our data. We don't know who's accessing it. We don't have the logs. We don't have the insight. And we've lost the security continuity. So before I could implement a policy and cover everybody in the company, ensure everybody has antivirus, everybody has two-factor authentication, everybody's resetting their passwords and they're super complex. I don't have the same confidence that my thousands of third-party vendors that I'm relying on to do business are implementing those same controls. And right now, the status quo is simply sending them a questionnaire to ask them if they're doing a good job. It's just a trust-based exercise. And this wasn't realized this was realized only up until recently, as we started to see breaches by association take place. So hackers realized that rather than brute forcing somebody's firewall login portal that's been publicly exposed, we could just go through a vendor or a partner. And a lot of times those vendors and partners already have all the data that we're looking for. So the company doesn't even know that their data's been exfiltrated, and probably the third party doesn't know either. So that 10-year gap is a ruh-roh type moment. And this is what chief information security officers and security owners are now facing today. What makes it even more challenging to sort of, I don't know if anybody's ever watched Charlie Brown, but this is the analogy I kind of thought about. What makes it even harder to, for security owners is drumming up budget and actually trying to obtain the money to purchase the tools that they need to protect even the fortress. And the often flow that you'll see, and this happens in literally every single organization that has, especially enterprise organizations, but even small business owners that have some type of security owner or CISO, the CEO or board member will be watching a shock piece on like Fox News about how Twitter was hacked or something in the morning, and they'll shoot an email, subject line, "How secure are we?" to the security owner of an organization. And the CISO goes, "Oh shit, like, well, that's a very difficult and complex question to answer, because you have many security tools monitoring the various layers of the security onion, and they all speak a different language. So some of your tools are saying you have web application vulnerabilities, some are saying you have open ports, some are saying computers have viruses, some of them have been cleaned, some of them haven't been, and it's very difficult to get a clear, concise picture that's not speaking on the nerdy techie level as a CISO would perceive it, but speaking on the apex level that chief officers and board of directors can really understand. And they understand simple layman's terms, metrics, key performance indicators. So what happens is the CEO and the board of directors ask, "How secure are we?" And the CISO starts talking about all of the technical vulnerabilities, and they just hear the, wah, 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 like sort of how the teachers in Charlie Brown used to speak. So the information gets lost in translation. And there's a big discrepancy between how how CFOs and board members feel about security as a cost center versus how the CISO feels. So generally, security budgets get slashed or outsourced. They save a bunch of money because they're not spending 6 figures on IDSs or IPSs or the complex hardware that's required to get the insight that a security owner would need. And they feel great. They're under budget. Go cloud. New vacation home. New company car. Like, it's a good feeling from the board to meet their fiscal goals and fulfill their obligations to shareholders. But this mentality leaves the chief information security officers or the security owners distraught, because now they're thinking, what do I do? How can I protect information that I can't see? I'm responsible for my own fortress. I'm responsible for the ecosystem of companies that I do business with. I don't own them. I don't operate them, but somehow I'm responsible for managing their security and making sure that my information doesn't get hacked out of their systems. It's a lose-lose situation. What's even more frustrating for a security owner is when you think about how the surface area of attack is widened exponentially as the fortress to ecosystem shift takes place. Traditionally with the fortress, you had companies doing direct attacks. So generally speaking, at least the high noise type attacks, you could detect in your own network. You would see people hitting your firewalls or see people trying to brute force SSH, for example, and it was somewhat easy to detect in logs if they were tuned properly. Now, as we increase our surface area and data moves into the habitat of employees who have endpoints distributed everywhere, and one more ring move into the ecosystem of all of the companies that we depend on to do business but don't necessarily own, the scope of attack is exponentially increased, and now you have not just one degree of threat, but you have 4 degrees of threat. My vendor's partner just got breached, and each link along the way has a security vulnerability that leads into my data center. And that's I would say one of the largest risks is that traversal through the various degrees of connection and reliability on the ecosystem. The other 2 parts that are particularly concerning is that a hacker can now indirectly exfiltrate data from your company without even knocking on your door. Traditional security tools, what do? They blast packets, they're simulating a hack attack, they're going to your house, they're rattling the door, they're shaking the windows to see if they're locked, they're tapping on the glass to see if you have any fractures. And lo and behold, they find out that this window is left open and the secret safe is right through that door. Now, we just have to look for an open port to a database that has administrative credentials on a third party that's storing your data in their data center and pull it right out. So you can pull company data from the core right from the outside layer of the ecosystem, or even from the middle layer, the employee sort of habitat, pulling data from an employee endpoint. As I said earlier, employees are walking around with their full their organization's full production environment. Every engineer is going to have that. That's the cost of doing business, and it's a good thing. You want that distribution and you want that empowerment, but it has to be used responsibly. So those 3 ways on the right, especially the top 2, are super easy using open source intelligence. They're completely stealth, so unless the vendor has some type of responsible disclosure in place where their partners that a breach has taken place, the core company is never going to find out. They're completely passive or even zero touch, and they're anonymous. The other big struggle that we see taking place is across the defense landscape. This is something called the 80-20 Pareto Principle. And the gist of this slide basically says that the legacy tools that we've been provided throughout the past 10, 15 years, these tool sets, haven't kept up with that shift, that paradigm shift from fortress to ecosystem. And what that's led to is we see that at least 80, and I would argue even 90% of the security tools that are out there are just not properly equipped to diagnose, assess, analyze, and remediate the ecosystem threats. They just don't have that insight or that transparency. They're still selling on sort of the fear, uncertainty, and doubt model. They generally, the way these security tools will work is they collect some data, they analyze it, and they spit out a report telling you all the reasons why you're screwed. Like, here's everything you need to fix, pat you on the back, good luck. If you don't have anybody in your organization that understands security or is a security owner, it's probably going to be very difficult to remediate these issues because they're not giving you any actionable intelligence that you can use to fix it. Like I mentioned earlier, they all speak different languages, so it's very difficult to pull them all together into one view and really understand at a metrics level what's going on. And without the metrics, without the dashboard, you're steering the ship blind. Arguably, what's more effective is the 20% or even the 3% of security controls that we implement in place, a lot of which can be based off of open source intelligence. So open source intelligence is all based around the context, right? You're telling a story based on these fragments of information. They're generally helping to prevent companies, prevent the quickest path to a breach. So rather than pounding on the firewall, I can just go look to see if any of your employees' credentials have been leaked on the internet, or start building profiles around your employees and use that to deduce passwords, log in, and wreak havoc. So this is preventing the quickest path, and this is also helping to prevent the win. And that 5, 10, 20% of effort is generally free or very, very low cost. A lot of it comes down to education and awareness, and it will cover just reminding employees every 2 months not to click weird links, not to do, how to create a truly complex passphrase, not just a weird password that's hard to remember. Those small things, they're not foolproof, but they'll cover a majority of threats that companies face. Now, what does open source intelligence answer? What questions does open source intelligence answer for enterprises? And you can think of open source intelligence, it's kind of like you're looking outward to look inward. The traditional way of thinking is we need more data. We have to mine more of our systems, collect all of it, archive it, put it all in one big system, and then somehow identify those little outliers and act on them, which is very, very challenging. Open source intelligence is the exact opposite methodology, which is let's not look inward, let's look outward. Let's look at everything that's already out in the public domain, that already exists on the public web, on the deep web, and let's see what we can deduce by concatenating this information together in a meaningful way. And that often not just tells you a piece of problem, but it tells you a whole story, and it tells you a whole thought process that's led up to that point. For your own company, for enterprises, OSINT is really meaningful because it gives companies insight into what a hacker can find out about them without knocking on the door. So rather than going and pounding on the windows and shaking the glass, maybe they're 3 miles away looking at your house through binoculars. Maybe they're trailing your vehicle on the way to work. And they're using these patterns to find the best window of opportunity to steal the data, or maybe places that you leave your data outside of your home. For third parties, I would argue that it's even more interesting and applicable because the big question that CISOs and security owners ask are my partners at least as scrupulous as I am in protecting my data? And if I have to rely on them for these business operations like Amazon and other cloud vendors, I need to know that they're doing at least as good of a job as I am in protecting my info. And if you think about the status quo, how do we do that right now? As I mentioned earlier, it's usually one or two or three ways. Most companies do nothing. They don't ask their partners any questions, and they just sign a contract, give them the data, and move on. We call that the ostrich mentality. Just put your head in the sand and don't think about it. The other way is questionnaires. So you send a 50-page questionnaire asking, do you have antivirus, do you have firewall, and I'm trusting you to fill it out accurately and correctly, but I have no way to validate. Or maybe I perform a lightweight pen test or do an on-site security assessment. Those are great, very useful, but they tell you their point in time. They tell you what's going on right now. They don't tell you what's going on in 5 minutes. And as we all know, data, historical data without any relevancy is useless. You need up-to-date, almost real-time information. And that information is what's actionable, and that information is what can actually plug the gaps and remediate future issues. Oh, and you can use, one thing I didn't mention is you can use open source intelligence not to deduce whether or not to do business with a third party, but you use it as a litmus test. You use it to say, does this company really know what they're doing? Do they have a mature security, information security process and program in place, or is it utter chaos? Have they had an issue for a day that they remediated, or have they had an issue that's persisted for 6 months which led up to their breach? And it doesn't mean you necessarily don't do business when you find open source intelligence issues. It means you confront the partners that you're working with and have a collaborative dialogue around what they're going to do to fix it. So thinking about what's available in terms of open source, it's really, I call it the open source world market. It's really, truly a medley of information that you can retrieve about a company, an individual, an organization, a lifestyle, just by looking outward at what already exists in the public consciousness. There's geospatial information, so location information about where somebody currently is, or their general day-to-day paths and habits, all sorts of metadata, so not just looking at the file itself, but what's behind the file. What are the notes and thoughts and usernames and paths and credentials that have been embedded in that information, and how can we use that and concatenate that with other information to form a pathway to breach. You can even look in print news. Sometimes just reading pieces of text that people have published or talked about or spoke about or bragged about will give you insight into what they're doing. Social media, obviously, an excellent source for open source intelligence. Monitoring social media effectively allows you to monitor the behaviors and pathways of every employee within an organization. And if you're thinking about breaching that organization, watching companies' behavioral patterns almost like a living, breathing organism allows you to find those holes, those windows for breach. Misconfigurations, Even looking at pictures, there's tons of information I'll talk about that you can pull just from a picture that's been taken. And this intelligence can be found pretty much everywhere. It's publicly accessible signals and data sets. You can a lot of times download them for free or use applications. There are some tools that are paid. They're generally fairly expensive to acquire. There are websites, databases that you can download. There are a lot of open source projects that help to enumerate this information. And a lot of it can just come from observation, literally just being aware. An over-the-shoulder observation, for example, could be a form of metadata, paying attention to sort of what's between the lines. So I'm going to give some examples of metadata that you can retrieve, what type of metadata we can find, some examples, how it's useful, and what you can do to sort of protect it. So what's in a name? From 1 or 2 bits of information, it's possible to enumerate a vast amount of personal details about an individual, especially if their name or the business that they work in or the city that they live in is an outlier. If it's especially unique, it's even easier to pinpoint just about everything about them. And that includes things like medical records. So when did you get a checkup? What are your medication prescriptions? What are your personal interests? Usernames are particularly useful from an enterprise standpoint. Vacation, family information, intimate details are also particularly useful for generating passwords or finding out when the CISO or sysadmins are on vacation and using that as a window of opportunity to breach. Finding out financial information, location information, government records, blueprints of the homes and vacation homes that people live in, court cases that they've been in, legal disclosures. All of this can be used to understand not just who a person is or where they live, but literally how they think, and sometimes even from birth up into date. So there are a lot of tools out there that help identify that window of opportunity using open source information on employees. So monitoring traffic patterns, searching for usernames and finding where they're registered. You can use, there's an ever-increasing amount of sort of open map or mind mapping tools that let you view this data as a living, breathing organism. So you can literally watch people's interactions and movements take place in real time, monitor their patterns, and use it accordingly. And it's kind of just like Santa Claus, like I see you when you're sleeping, I know when you're awake. You know, companies have to know, companies have to educate their employees that, and sysadministrators that people are observing them from the outside in. You don't know it, but they're, especially for security organizations, you know, your information is public, people are monitoring you, and people can take advantage of people can exploit your behavioral patterns in very nefarious ways. Now, how do you remediate against it? It's tough. You know, education and policy, I think, is really key from an organizational perspective, from an enterprise organization. Security awareness training goes probably further than anything else that you can do in an organization. Just telling employees, educating them that there's something called location services that they can turn off, educating them that their information can be tracked and pulled via, their geospatial information can be pulled via an API. Raising their level of awareness, implementing corporate policies like two-factor authentication, ensuring strong passwords are made, and really just reducing their overall exposure by showing them how to tweak things accordingly. Another example is Google dorking. So Google dorking is crafting, they're specially crafted Google queries using keyword filters or a concatenation of keyword filters to enumerate some piece of information. And from Google dorking, you can retrieve quite a bit of sensitive information, credentials. I was just messing around the other night with some Google dorks, and I was able to enumerate VPN keys for an Ivy League academic university. You can pull directories that were unintentionally exposed, live video streams from people's homes and corporations, and lots of other personal info. And if you know, for example, the path of, say, a portal for a piece of hardware or software like a shared drive or a Cisco router, you can start to break up the terms of the path and use it. So some of the first ones, for example, look for, in the URL, they look for FTP. They know the URL directory path of a Seagate cloud hard drive has FTP, Seagate, backup, plus, and drive. And if you search for that, you'll enumerate everything that Google has gone through and indexed that was inadvertently exposed. VPN keys, looking for DAT files or other examples. And the real key here is really just to know thyself is the best piece of advice. Performing searches, Google alerts on your name, your company's name, doing sensitive data discovery both inside the organization and in the public internet, and finding the root cause analysis. How did this get here? Was it a misconfiguration? What happened that caused the information to be leaked? Also, removing it from indexes can help. Metadata is particularly interesting. Metadata is the data behind the data. So when somebody takes a picture, for example, there's all sorts of information about the details of what device took the picture, what was the aperture, what was the lighting, what was the latitude and longitude, where were they located, and this is all embedded in the file itself. So from metadata, and there's metadata in Word documents, Google documents, Office documents, PDFs. You can extract hardware details, database details. You can find out operating systems, insecure browser plugins, again, location data. Looking at database metadata, you can sometimes not just pull password hashes or leak credentials, but also know what the secret questions that customers or companies are using to reset their password. User IDs are handy, and also just thought processes, command line, notes, transcripts. Metadata sort of was originated, you think about things like microfiche and slides. They used to stamp them with the dates or the manufacturer. You think about libraries using the Dewey Decimal System. These were sort of the origins of metadata, and it's really evolved to digital presence. A lot of tools you can use to detect metadata. FOCA is a good example. You can upload directories of files or paths, and it will extract all of the metadata behind it. There's a great example of a metadata leak when John McAfee was sort of fleeing from the government of Belize or gangs that he didn't pay off. They were chasing after him, and while in transit, he decided to meet up with a Vice reporter, and one of the reporters took a picture of him, while he was running away, they took a picture, and they accidentally forgot to scrub the EXIF data from the picture, and they posted it on Gizmodo. They enumerated his entire location. You can see the latitude, the longitude, the altitude, so it's pinpointed to a T, even the camera information that was used. And they published it on the public internet, which, again, I think was a bit wrong, but they posted it on Gizmodo. It was there for everybody to see. So how do you defend against metadata leaks? Again, going back to awareness, if you just tell your employees that there is data behind the data, they will all of a sudden be conscious that there's another layer that they don't necessarily see but exists. Switching off options that intentionally leak metadata, like your location, will definitely help to reduce some of that. And also you can scrub or edit the metadata. There's online tools. There are OS-based applications that you can run that will scan and strip out that info. There are a lot of ways we see, a lot of information we see, especially in enterprise, pieces of very sensitive information that get leaked out via open source intelligence methods. So these are some common pitfalls that we see in the community. So finding sensitive DNS records, we'll see companies use public DNS servers to resolve internal domains, and that information will get leaked on the internet, or you can enumerate it and find intranet.corp.com, which is probably meant to be internal only. Loads and loads of private keys, those are a goldmine. Most developers, unfortunately, aren't trained to put passphrases on their secret keys, so you can generally hijack those and use them immediately. If you have access to a source code repository, you can find all sorts of hard-coded comments that have keys, leaks, thought processes, improvements that they haven't made yet, vulnerabilities. Publicly exposed endpoints is an interesting one. So, when a retail company, for example, makes an API call to process a credit card, they may have an exchange point, a server. It may be called, company credit card processing.com, so you don't necessarily know it's related to the original company, but they use that endpoint to process credit card calls, and that endpoint maybe has to be publicly exposed for one reason or another, so that information can be enumerated. Version info, banner info are sort of no-brainers. Pulling a version and then looking for the correlated vulnerabilities manually or with tools. Stack trace errors, another piece of information that's leaked that tells more about an unintended exception that took place in your stack. And leaked employee credentials. That's another super easy one. So, finding, and you could argue that maybe the credential that they use to register on Adobe.com isn't the same credential that they use in their company. But the real takeaway there is you educate your employees in your organization not to use their corporate password to register on personal websites. I was at a big Fortune 100 bank just recently, and we found that one of their employees had used their corporate password to register on a Bitcoin website. So how do you think the financial firm felt about employees using Bitcoin and using their corporate address? They weren't too happy. Another example of OS intelligence, maybe observational OS intelligence. So I mentioned it earlier, just being aware, over-the-shoulder looks. You could, even with a high-powered camera or lens, somebody doing espionage could see what you're looking at through the reflection in your glasses, enumerate who you're talking to, or even look at the pupil itself and find out what you're looking at or who you're speaking to based on the reflection. So more of just kind of food for thought. So what do you do with the data? How do you make it actionable? How do you make it useful? You collect all of these random points. The next thing you do is you have to spend some time analyzing and finding out what's really meaningful, separating the real true signals from the noise. And then you take action. If you see employee credentials leaked, you make sure that they're not using the same credential, or better yet, just force them to reset their password. If you find a database leak, you need to have a run book or a plan book in place to know how you're going to respond if this information shows up on the internet. And then you make sure that you verify it, make sure that it's truly plugged. Not just plugged, but make sure that you also have the long-term processes in place that will prevent it from going forward. So again, root cause analysis. How did the problem get there? How do we make sure it doesn't happen again? Most companies don't spend the time looking back in hindsight and deducing the problem, and then implementing a real solution to make sure it doesn't happen again. But that's key to avoiding recurrence. And with third parties, it's really the matter of, the way I like to put it is cognitive realignment. When you're working with your third-party partners, rather than thinking of it as a hostile engagement where they send you a questionnaire and it's BS, and then you ask them for audit reports and they don't want to give them to you, and it becomes this very arduous process. Working with third parties, the methodology has to pivot to joint collaboration. It's all about working with third parties to find these issues, to analyze them, and then work together. Joint collaboration. Work with your partners and say, we need to have a talk. I want to keep doing business with you, but I need to make sure that you're at least as secure as I am. Otherwise, I don't want to store my data with you. So let's work together to actually validate what we found on the public internet. Let's put a plan in place to remediate it, and then again, validate it, and then we feel comfortable. And then what happens is a beautiful thing. I don't own or operate any of these companies, but I've somehow influenced their security posture. And in turn, I've uplifted the security posture of my entire ecosystem, my entire hive, where all of my data is located. Now, there are some challenges with open source intelligence. Accuracy definitely varies based on the methodology and techniques that you're using or the volume of data that you're processing. There's certainly a high signal-to-noise ratio, so we see that in commoditized intelligence feeds or any super large data sets. A lot of open source data sets don't have too much accurate information, so you need to it's like panning for gold. You have to look through a lot of sort of sand and fine grain to find the meaningful nugget. The disappearing act, open source intelligence isn't always there. You might find it pop up one day, and then the next day it's been pulled down or banned or censored. Making sure the information is accurate and validated. If you're trying to look for this information non-intrusively, you may not want to use the credentials to log into a third-party network, at least on your own home network to start. Automation and scale is really tricky. So, you can put one or two headcount in an enterprise toward sifting for this info, but to scale it up and automate it and have it constantly populating, and maybe not just for your company, but all of your vendors is very, very challenging. I don't have a good answer for that one. And also trying to find trends, trying to find predictions. How do I don't need to know how my vendor was doing 6 months ago. I need to know how they're doing right now and if they're trending towards a breach. And sometimes that information can be tricky without having the infrastructure to look at the historical context. And also cadence, finding out, okay, I see a vulnerability, they patched it, but how long did it take for the next vulnerability and patch to take place? And having to do that manually can be very exhausting. And I think I'm out of time. That's it on my side. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer.
So what does SecurityScorecard do? Do you provide services or a tool or how
SecurityScorecard is a cloud-based platform. It's a service that companies use. They simply enter the URL of the company they want to assess, and within seconds we retrieve a complete non-intrusive security assessment looking from the outside in. So it's 100% non-intrusive, it's 100% self-service, and it helps companies look at themselves and their third-party partners and actually be able to predict when a breach is going to take place, reach out to that company proactively, close the loop, and remediate their issues so that they can continue to do business. So it's a business intelligence tool that gives companies additional transparency and insight. Okay. Great. Thank you, everyone.